My name is Eugene O. I'm going to be sharing this round. On OG, we have Lonzo Noodle Lover. Is that correct? Yeah. And OO, acupuncture works. CG, constitutionally, HCARES, CO, capstone 411. Is this all correct? Without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open the government. Here.
We think that these narratives are contributing to push some certain person to death and sacrifice these people. And moreover, we think these narratives are contributing to hinder the root cause of the situation and such a thing. We think that we have to fix the situation, and we think that it's a regrettable thing. That's why we are proud to propose. So based on that, before looking at this, I mentioned some clarification. What does reject mean? Reject means wrongly opposing it or negating it, and it's something regrettable and disgusting things. That is what the reject means in this day. And then I have two things in my speech. Firstly, within that institution where the failure happens, how this narrative works within that institution and how it causes the individual and institutional pressure. And secondly, without this narrative, how this institution can better improve the situation and how can then better restore the situation and how the better taking responsibility in the practice. So we must make first point on how within the institution this narrative works. Well, firstly, I have to like the characteristic of the insect Jesus in this day. Firstly, we have to recognize here, firstly, by committing the insect Jesus are like no other people have no longer the other people, for example, your family or your colleagues have to take responsibility for the failure because that certain person takes the responsibility and they commit suicide. Secondly, and it especially happens in our institution because within the institution, for example, company or nation, government, and so on. Within these institutions, they serve a lot of responsibility and they can cause a lot of impact on other people. In these contexts, how insecticides happens. So, firstly, I will emphasize. I will analyze about how it works within the institution. As I analyzed here, by committing suicide, these certain persons are considered that they can successfully take all the responsibility about the failure. And if it causes malicious intention for the other people around him or her, for example, because in order to hide their own failure, some person will make his colleague, his or her colleague, or scapegoat, kind of scapegoat. Because after his friend commits suicide and commit their insecticide, that person will no longer need to take any responsibility for that situation. It is on that occasion we think that by detecting their insecticide as something normal, this narrative will be utilized within the niche institution to avoid some certain responsibility about that failure. On that occasion, we think that our certain person will be sacrificed by his or her colleague for the sake of their own malicious intent influence. And then I have two remarks within the situation. Firstly, for the institution, because the person who are at their core who are blameworthy for that failure will commit suicide. We couldn't hear any information about their failure. We couldn't understand why they have in reality. We cannot have any information in the relation. So on that occasion, we think that other people on team will distort the information so that this person can avoid the responsibility, and moreover without any malicious intention, because if that person commits suicide, their failure become kind of taboo. No people want to touch about this thing, talk about things, and then this situation will be their research for their failure and any other resolution will be stopped at the time. And secondly, we think in our personal, it can cause a personal problem, individual tragedy, because suddenly, for example, please imagine that you commit some significant failure, and your friends, your colleague, sacrifice you to avoid some part of responsibility. Certainly, you to some extent you are responsible for that failure, but it is not to the extent you have to pay your life for the to take responsibility. On that occasion, we think that the individual tragedy to force someone will be coerced to take responsibility by paying their life. That is the second impact we can think within this way. So after we reject this narrative, all the narrative about our preached defect or defect such as something horrible, what will happen? We think no person will unable to utilize that narrative and to utilize the narrative to push some person to the death. We think it becomes impossible. On that occasion, we think that in terms of taking responsibility, because that person, for example, if I commit some failure, I will be possible to restore the situation by providing some information and providing some labor forces for that restoration. And we think it's a better way to take responsibility. For example, in the compensation for the traffic accident, we will pay money, we will pay other things for the restoration, and it's a better. It is considered and accepted as a better way to take responsibility. And secondly, we think after it becomes impossible to utilize that narrative, there are you are no longer be able to be sacrificed for the things, and for those reasons, because for the sake of the practical improvement of the situation and principle taking responsibility, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Now I'd like to invite the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition piece. We're here.
Summarize the open government case into one sentence. We think that they proposes this motion because it leads to this disaster, leads to making perpetrators escape from responsibility. We think that that argument is not actually fulfilling the government burden because they are not actually proving that all those kind of deaths or resulting by this responsibility-driven death should be conceived regrettable and disgusting. But we think that they are only portraying the part of the death that is actually leading to making the person escape from responsibility. we are going to prove to you why in two levels. Firstly, there are actually honorable cases of doing those kind of responsibility-driven death. And secondly, even if their case stands, even if there are some like responsibility escaping those kind of deaths, why it still be justified to not consider this regrettable or not consider this disgusting. All the rebuttals, therefore, will be included in the second argument in the three levels of analysis. Firstly, talking about the honorable death. We think that this inseki jijasu can happen also when there's no direct responsibility. For example, the examples quoted in the info side says about the school headmasters after fatal accidents of school property or like pollution not being actually turned out to be guilty, but they are accused or charged of major financial like corruption or whatnot. And also parents of children who commit serious crimes. We think that those are also include the cases of where this person cannot be held criminally liable because in the criminal like constitution or criminal like law, there is no such like thing to hold those parents or hold those politicians criminally liable. So we think that there are cases where there is no direct perpetrator and there are only victims remaining. We think that there are cases where those people cannot be held criminally liable because they do not fulfill the category of criminal justice system. We think that there are cases when those people do everything that they can do because of their guilt or their moral sense of like their duty to fulfill. We think that in those cases where they did compensation, where they did provide labor, we think those cases, which is the burden of the government side that they have to also defend. We think that in those cases, the only reason that these people actually commit suicide is because of their sense of guilt and because of their breach of morality. We think that in those cases, the social institutions such as the court or such as like compensating like civil in terms of civil sense, we think that those things cannot fulfill their job of mitigating their guilt. So therefore, we think that this is the choice of those people who have already fulfilled their responsibility in a social sense to actually go to another level and actually commit suicide because they think that that is the only way to actually push for responsibility or whatnot. We think that this cases, this is the, we are going to clarify once more that this is also the cases because the government has the burden to defend all the inseki jijasu. We think that this cases, even on those cases where those people had fulfilled their responsibility in terms of criminal level and also in the civil level, why those people should have to should be also held responsible or should be also held regrettable or disgusting because of their death. We think that this is also the case that the government side should defend, but they did not. So therefore, we think that those kind of breach of morality or the breach of guilt, the sense when those kind of sense of guilt and morality actually led those people to commit suicide, we think that that should be their option and that should be considered as their choice. That is actually a response like legitimate when they actually did everything that they can do in terms of criminal level and civil level.
So don't misrepresent our argument. We say this narrative will be utilized by some people A to sacrifice people B and to avoid the responsibility.
Okay, that was our second argument, which is all the rebuttals will be incorporated in the second argument. That actually leads on to our second argument about when there is a perpetrator and when there is a victim, why there is escaping from responsibility. Actually, it's not a problem and not really a serious problem as the government side actually calls to you. Three levels of analysis. Firstly, we think that just by a perpetrator committing suicide or just by them actually dying, we think that not everyone thinks that they did their job or they actually did their responsibility or whatnot. We think that criticism still exists even after the person died. So for example, in South Korea, there was one famous figure actually died because there was an accusation of sexual crime. We think that even after he committed death, we think that there is also criticism still existing toward that person. We think that this actually is a more severe form of criticism because the criticism does not go away because of that famous figure actually dying. We think that actually leads to actually furthering or exacerbating the level of criticism that is going to those persons, the remaining criticism even after death. We think that is also more detrimental to the reputation of that famous figure itself. So therefore, we think that we are actually pushing for further responsibility even after those dead people actually die. Second level of response. We think that there are very, very many spectrums of morality. So therefore, as the opening government said, we think that is not the case when these people leave, they will suddenly become moral and suddenly commit to the society by making some labor forces or actually compensating them. We think that when they actually leave, when those people who are scared and afraid to actually evade the responsibility actually live and instead of being dying, we think that they will either rather choose the way of hiding their responsibility or hiding those kind of things. We think that we cannot actually anticipate them to suddenly live morally and suddenly do all the responsibility that they actually pursue. So therefore, we think that they are actually, even if it is not a best case scenario, we're avoiding the worst case scenario where those people actually live and they actually hide away from the responsibility. We think that they actually committing death is a better form for those people with the intermediate sense of morality, like they are actually breachable and whatnot. We think that for those people, they are actually doing their job of like taking responsibility, because we think that those people will not suddenly turn into a moral person and actually do the compensation and fulfill all the responsibility while living. So therefore, we think that this was the second level of analysis. And last form of analysis, we think that even if they actually escape from responsibility and the level of criticism actually goes down, like let's assume that case, we think that even in that case, we think that death is the most extreme form of punishment. We think that because like those people actually do those kind of things, we think that like when those people actually commit death, we think that they did those kind of like taking responsibility in terms of doing what society considers the most extreme form of punishment. We think that those two things are not mutually exclusive. First, saying that those people did their job or did their responsibility by committing suicide, and secondly, not pushing the responsibility to the victims. We can actually acknowledge that this person actually did some responsibility in terms of committing suicide, but on the other hand, we cannot push the responsibility to the victims, and we do not think that those two things are mutually exclusive. We think that the government has a burden to prove that even if we like the OJ's case, they have to prove why this inevitably leads to lessening the criticism and pushing the burden to the victims, responsibility to the victims. So therefore, we think that the government has not fulfilled their goal. Therefore, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to the podium. You're here.
I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, how these narratives will create vicious cycle that deserve to be rejected. And secondly, what's the form of taking responsibility that deserves to be honored, and how these two actions are trade-off, and we have to reject all narratives that depict insects as honor. But before that, let's engage the previous speaker. Firstly, the previous speaker claimed that we didn't fulfill the BOP by saying that we only reject the insect Jesus. But no, we are rejecting the narrative itself. Because we think that those narratives will make it impossible for institutions to make further investigations as to why those problems happen, or who is actually responsible, or what should have been done. We believe that this narrative will make it difficult for the society or for the institutions to find a reason or find a person to make people to feel that they are a part of the mistakes. And I'm going to talk about this logic later. But so we are rejecting the narrative itself. We are not only rejecting the insect. And then the previous speaker, the first argument was that there are some honorable cases where people feel a sense of guilt and commit suicide. We think that the opening opposition failed to prove why they still failed to prove that why it has to be honorable, why the media people has to glorify the suicide. Because we think that at the moment they commit suicide, even if that's because of the sense of guilty, we believe that they are escaping from the responsibility that they have to take living. For example, they have to tell others the background of the mistakes, or what should have been done, or who are involved in the mistakes, in order to prevent the next failure. We believe that dying might be one choice, but that shouldn't be glorified, because there are more. There are the real responsible action for those people are not committing suicide. And we believe that these kind of action will just create a vicious cycle. I'm going to talk about that in my first argument. And finally, let's engage the second argument, which was to say when people when people are responsible, they should also they also have to be that should also be glorified. And we think that they they never prove to us that that the dying is a form of taking responsibility. Dying can be a compensation. They just say that it's much better than dying without taking any responsibility. But they fail to prove that dying can be a compensation. That dying can be better solution for the victims that was created by their failures. So moving to the first issue about how the vicious cycles will be created and why this vicious cycle deserves to be rejected. So there are two kinds of mechanisms that create other insecticide after glorifying these kind of things. Firstly, this is internal pressure inside these people committing suicide. When they make a failure, the whole media or whole society will start criticizing them. As to there are lots of broadcasting that denies their identity or their past actions. In that occasion, what these people most want is the forgiveness from a society. And if we have a former, and there are former example which glorifies the suicide of these people, we believe that this is the moment when they will take no other actions, and they want to be forgiven by dying, because they know that if those top people die, the society will stop criticizing them, stop broadcasting about their families or their past, their identity. Why society will stop criticizing them? Because we think that when people are dead, it's gonna be recognized as a shame to criticize the dead people. We don't say bad thing about dead people because they don't exist anymore. If you say bad thing about dead people, it's gonna be like the society will see it as unjust because those dead people cannot say anything back to you. So the whole society will go to the direction to forgive these people who committed suicide. That's the reason why this internal pressure will drive them to the suicide. And there are also other pressures, which is to say that the people around these people who made a mistake will say that will bring this person about the former cases of the former case where the top committed suicide and the institution was forgiven. So we think this is how the vicious cycle will be created, and how the solution, the real solution, will never be able. So we think that, and the second issue, so we think that the most desirable form of taking responsibility is where those persons live and talk about the reason why their failure happened, and they compensate, they apologize to the victims, so that the victims, the feeling can be better. And why these are trade-off? Because when people die, they can't say anything, they can't prove anything about the former failures. So we think this is a trade-off of these two actions are trade-off. If these are trade-off, we think glorifying this wrong action that's not taking any responsibility and just ignore the compensation, ignore the victims. We think that shouldn't be glorified, because those institutions will continue to make financial failure. The schools will continue to have bullying between the children. We think that's really problematic, and from this perspective, we also are really proud to propose.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite the deputy leader of opposition to the podium. Here.
Madam Speaker, there was a case in the Hurricane Katrina period where one of the firefighters committed suicide because obviously this firefighter was in the rescue mission because there was lack of manpower. He committed suicide because he failed to rescue a family from a flood that he could not control. Madam Speaker, I don't want to justify a case where a person commits honor suicide to cover up a sexual abuse that he committed. I agree that this is a situation where he needs to rot in prison for a lifetime. But that's not the debate, right? I, as DLO, have no obligation to justify all honor suicide as they try to push us to do in this debate, because it's this motion that forces them to say that no honor suicide at all can be justified in all circumstances. That is what the motion asks of them. Opposition's duty in this debate, let's make it clear, is to justify that in certain cases this can be justified. And all the harms that they prove to you are general harms of honor suicide, which I believe proves that honor suicide is generally a bad thing. Doesn't prove why honor suicide can never be tolerated. Because look, I think all of their cases contingent upon the idea. Look, let's look at the motion slide beforehand, right? Because I think that the motion slide clearly says that honor suicide, it happens to take responsibility, or at least feel the feeling of responsibility for a significant failure. Nowhere in the motion does it limit this debate to a crime, right? Significant failures from the individual's perspective. As in the case of this firefighter that could not save a family from getting swept away by a flood. What are we to name shame this person and say that this person is a bad person, this person needed to testify when he didn't cause a crime to begin with, right? So I don't think that they're trying to engage with us to begin with, right? And their case, moreover, I'll take you later, their case I think is very contingent upon the idea that as long as these people don't commit suicide, magically somehow, society has the capacity to find out the exact cause of the social failure and the social crime, which I don't think they get to take as a fiat to begin with, right? There's always a possibility, and actually a pretty high possibility in the case of corporate structural failures where they actually cover up these issues, there's a high chance that these people won't be found out to begin with. In which case, I think that Suyon's impact in this debate is that in that scenario, at least we prevent the worst case scenario where this person takes no liability, at least this guy commits suicide. Because I think that's the case where this person, even if we engage with their example of atrocities regarding crimes, I think we take that comparative, right? Also, they tell you that living is a responsibility and that a person needs to testify what actually happened, which is the only pseudo-engagement that they have to our case, right? Number one, I think that we clarified the criteria very specifically in this debate, and they need to engage with that criteria instead of saying that we strawman their case, because we didn't, right? We took their case, we understand, that doesn't justify all of it, right? We told you two criteria, maybe. Sorry, I'll take you later. Number one, when a person did not directly cause the offense and had nothing to do with directly causing the crime and had no knowledge of that case. Like in the motion slide, there is an information in the case where a parent commits suicide because of a child that accidentally threw a brick out of a window and managed to kill a person, right? In which case, okay, the parent had the legal duty, fine. I know that they're going to say that. But number one, if that's a situation that the parent testified everything that she knew about that situation, if that's a situation where the parent compensated as much as she could for the family person that actually died and the families that actually died, and she still feels that guilt, and there is no way, and this is our second criteria by the way, there is no social platform or mechanism through which she can actually take care of the remaining guilt, and that is the situation where I think she is justified in actually committing suicide, and the society does not get to name shame this person simply because that person committed suicide. I don't think that they engage with our case to the fullest extent. But let's move on to the extensive case that I want to offer to you. But before that, yes, closing.
Eating less food can sometimes be good for your health, but would you therefore support a narrative that glorifies globally people consuming far less food to become thinner over time?
No. That's not really a parallel example to this case, obviously, because I'm not trying to justify or say that honor suicide is generally a good thing to begin with. Because honor suicide to cover up, as I said, sexual abuse, like people do in South Korea these days, I think that those are atrocious harms that deserve a lifetime appointment in prison. I don't want to justify these people, like in the terrorist motion, right? I don't have to justify terrorism when the motion says this house believes that terrorism can be justified, right? Same example, same motion. So let's move on to the comparative argument that I have for you. We tell you that these people, we need to, whenever a person commits suicide, we need to assess the effects it may have on the people who have close connections to that person. Those people being the family of relatives, the friends and colleagues of that person, right? We tell you that in cases where the suicide committer committed suicide when he or she did not directly cause or have direct liabilities for a certain social failure or crime. By the way, social failure, don't limit this debate to crimes, right? To these people, they are devastated. These relatives usually think that these people were unfairly sacrificed for a problem that they had no liability over, especially in those cases where that's what the relatives feel. Consider the case where society shames them now because society feels, like they said, that they didn't fulfill their responsibility, but in which case I think is very untrue. I think in the case of the firefighter, society actually empathized with this person, saying that, no, that was an honorable suicide, but you shouldn't have done it, but it's an honorable suicide, right? The stigma, actually, if society shames these people, what happens is the stigma of the shamed person that committed suicide passes on to the relatives. They are branded as the relatives and friends of the dishonored person. And I don't think that this is a collateral damage that can be justified when these people and the relatives themselves obviously didn't have anything to do directly with the crime that was caused to begin with. I think that if that's the case, that's a third-party harm that results, especially in cases of their model. So I think that this is a contribution that we bring to you over in this debate. I'm going to conclude my speech by organizing what I said, right? Number one, I don't think it's opposition's duty to justify all murders and honor suicides to begin with. If that's their contention, they're out of this debate. I think, number two, I think that we've laid to you the criteria. First, no direct responsibility. Two, where there is no way for that person to fully compensate or repair the harm, and there is no platform for this person to relieve himself of the guilt. If they do not engage with these criteria, I don't think that they deserve to take this debate. How to propose?
Thank you, Ziola. That concludes the opening half. Now let's invite the government members to open the closing half of this debate. Period.
In the aftermath of horrific incidents that shock us all, society as a large likes to imagine that a drastic action can redeem an individual and return the world to our comfortable silence that was status quo before this incident happened. In our desperation for closure at any cost and any cost, we have now formed kangaroo courts to decide who should die, why they should die, and why they deserve this matter of justice. We reject this. We're going to approach this debate under two levels. Firstly, why this deifies perpetrators and therefore makes harm to victims. I think OJ told us why it was wrong to harm victims. We'll tell you directly why this is important and the impacts this leads to on their individual lives and how they seek redress. Secondly, we're going to talk about why kangaroo courts are now formed and are disproportionately harmful and how it unfairly condemns individuals who have done wrong but perhaps deserve much better from our current justice system. Before that, responses to OO, although integrations obviously exist. Firstly, O's case is this, and this is why they lose. They say their debate only applies in cases where individuals have done wrong but are not criminally liable in court. If you are not criminally liable, perhaps you shouldn't be forced to commit suicide. I think in the vast majority of cases where you can't be found guilty, then this public harassing of you and saying that you are the person responsible shouldn't happen. But it does happen in status quo. That's why the principal committed suicide after the Sewell Ferry incident, because the entire country condemned him and said it was his fault for deciding to go on this vacation trip. But secondly, even if we're talking about situations where individuals did wrong, I think it's a little odd for them to say that these individuals are moral enough to do the honorable thing and die, but refuse to go to court and admit wrongdoing. I think vast majority of cases, the kind of people who are willing to try to reclaim their honor feel some sense of guilt, feel some sense of sorrow for their actions, and they're choosing a method in which to redeem themselves. If society does not say that method is to commit suicide, probably they will go to more conventional methods, which is to go through court systems. I think this is likely to happen, not absolutely likely, but far better than their system, which says that because you're not likely to go to court, all people should be driven to death. But finally, I think OO is moving away from their burden, because their burden isn't to just say, here's one example and this is why this example is okay. They must absolutely face the fact that defending all coercive cases, if some people do this, then it creates ambiguities and rooms for interpretations of how justice should be dealt out with and the consequences of what people are doing. Therefore, it creates perceptual norms in society that affects other people. So this isn't a pick and choose where society says, okay, you should die, but in a large sense, if some people are doing this, then it pushes other individuals who have now committed this drastic act, who are very feeling shameful of their actions, to do the same thing because this is being perpetuated all throughout society. I think OO is out of this debate. But then, therefore, our two arguments. Firstly, why it creates an ambiguity of situation, why this is harmful. Firstly, what is the situation like? It's like when, after a crime or wrongdoing, some individual designated by the public to be responsible is now driven to commit suicide. This can happen either through narratives and the mass public want this, or media narratives, which we're also going to discuss in our second argument. Why is this harmful? It creates an ambiguity of a situation that oftentimes in the aftermath of death, we heroify and deify these people. That some people will glorify it, saying that these people are brave people who have paid for their sins, and they're honorable people. So instead of talking about just whether or not the suicide was honorable, they also tend to deify the past actions of the individual as well. Because the individual is dead. This is the only moment you have time to talk about the good things this person did. But unfortunately, oftentimes the discussion is very focused on the good things, because this person has died. Why is this the case? Especially in the East Asian context in which this debate is largely applicable, oftentimes there's a sanctity associated with death that many people do not want to go against. That's why in the aftermath of Romulan president's honorific suicide after he received bribes, no one wanted to prosecute him anymore, no one wanted to talk about his crimes, because there's a sanctity that surrounds death, that all the prosecutors and judges involved are now going to be deemed by the public as terrible people who don't give a damn about people who have just died. That's why I think there's ambiguity. Why does this therefore deprive opportunities for victims to find closure? Two things. Firstly, that if you say these are people who are heroes who have already paid, and then therefore why can't people move on? This creates two problems. Firstly, in the fact that these victims can no longer seek monetary redress, because oftentimes these victims are also victims of economic situations. They want compensation, but it's hard for them to go to court because the person who has all the evidence reliable and all the goodwill to prosecute has suddenly committed suicide, now therefore turning the narratives against you. But secondly, you're cheated from justice in the fact that now public narrative turns to more talking about why it is something that the victim should move on from, instead of talking necessarily about why this is good or bad thing. But second argument, second extension now, why this is a disproportionate punishment and why this kangaroo curse. Firstly, I think that oftentimes these situations are created by public pressure. In that, to recover honor, the public must agree to some extent that you are someone who can recover honor by committing suicide. That means oftentimes the public has large amounts of say in pressuring individuals, saying that the only way you can redeem yourself is to die. And this is narratives that are already perpetuated. What happens therefore? You create kangaroo courts, and this is direct clash with OO, talking about how some people can't go to courts. Oftentimes these courts are now made by the media. These courts are made by the mass public, who now decide who is guilty and therefore should commit suicide. Why is this such a big problem in our status quo? I think this creates two problems. Firstly, even when you're talking about people who are guilty, I think all guilty people still receive fair trials, still receive fair punishment. If you unfairly push them towards committing suicide through media narratives, I think this is very harmful to our justice system at large. Not just that in that it makes the justice system less trustworthy, but it makes that these people's crimes also go unnoticed. But secondly, we also have to question who creates norms in the status quo. The majority of citizens create norms, which means the majority ethnic race or the majority population in power gets to create these narratives. It also means that media narratives, who are controlled by majority ethnic race, or in most cases men, now get to decide who should die and what kind of suicide is admirable. Which means that it unfairly harms minorities and women who are not part of creating these norms and narratives. Therefore, now the people who are driven to commit ritual suicide unfairly lose out are the minorities and the very people who are weakest in these kind of situations. But finally, why is this a harm to individual wrongdoers? We're not just talking about why it's unjust, because these people deserve rehabilitation, these people deserve chances to defend themselves, but it's also a unjust in that it is an active harm to the perpetrator, not meted out by the government, but now meted out by the public, saying that you must die. But it also creates harms to people associated with the actor, the families, the friends that they've left behind, which means that now instead of incarceration, where you can still talk it out with your family members who have committed this action, you can still find closure as the family member of the perpetrator. Now all these mechanisms are no longer available for you. Now the public has deprived innocent people of their family members because they have deemed that they want some form of closure. Ultimately, this disengages people with the justice system because they realize the justice system is sham. The only thing that's important is the ability of the media and the people at large to decide. In the end of the day, we think this is not justice at all. We reject this on all levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Now I'd like to invite the opposition members to the podium.
After all the constructive speeches, because no further arguments can be brought out, what everyone forgot was the idea that narratives don't exist in a vacuum. Just because there is a narrative that Inseki Jijatsu is honorable does not mean that everybody automatically believes it's honorable, such that everybody who finds themselves in a situation where the public is prosecuting them, where there is trial by the media, automatically wants to commit Inseki Jijatsu. We have to examine this debate from the lens of how this particular narrative interacts with other things and what essentially is its impact on all the actors that are involved. And that's exactly what we will do coming from closing opposition. The first thing I want to do is clarify what the debate is not about. And we don't think it's about the resolution of crimes. Primarily because if you're going to take a look at a lot of the circumstances, the investigation process, corruption, for example, mismanagement, even the cases that were talked about coming from closing government are usually resolved through other means. So finally, if you cannot have testimony from the dead individual, chances are you're going to find data records. You're going to ask testimonies from other people. It is possible for courts to posthumously decree on the matter. We do understand that in some cases we won't be able to get monetary remuneration, but we think that majority of the circumstances, it is actually institutions that pay monetary remunerations. So regardless of who died, naturally there is going to be a resolution of the crime, and naturally the victims will get their closure because what they want is the resolution of the crime, not exactly the payment. So with that, I think that cancels out half of the case coming from government side. The real debate is actually how we should treat life or death, Madam Speaker. And I think that there are two priorities coming with this. The first is, how do we deal with potential victims of Inseki Jijatsu? And second is, how do we deal with the memory or even the existence of people who have already committed this particular form of suicide? And under which I'm going to analyze the role that narratives play and why exactly, on closing opposition, we defend the existence of these narratives and why we don't think that they should be absent. Because naturally, if you reject it, then government wants a world where these narratives wouldn't have otherwise existed. Sit down, I'll take you after the first point. Rebuttals will be integrated. First, how do we deal with potential Inseki Jijatsu victims? The first thing I want to say, and I want to examine first the idea of suicide, right? Because we have to realize that suicide is not a behavior that is learned. According to psychology, suicide ideation usually comes from within. It is considered as an abnormal behavior because the natural instinct of mankind is to protect one's life. And that's why when people want to kill themselves, that's considered as an abnormal kind of behavior that necessitates therapy or even medication, right? We say that Inseki Jijatsu, therefore, is not a learned behavior, but rather it is only a manifestation of an internal problem that individuals face. So we say, and that's why the entire argumentation coming from closing government about how kangaroo courts are basically implicating individuals and pushing them to the verge of suicide is not true. Because it is impossible for external stimuli to be the only reason why people commit suicide. In majority of cases, there is already suicide ideation within these particular individuals, just only fed by the rhetoric of people outside, right? Which means, and this is what the implication is, on either side, Madam Speaker, regardless of whether or not the narrative exists, it is possible for people to still concoct the idea that it is supposed, they are supposed to commit suicide because of their mistakes. On either side of the house, people will commit suicide. The greater question that we have to ask is, what kind of narrative do we need in order to engage people who are already having suicide ideation? We say that it's much important to have the narrative of the possible honorability of suicide. Because if you're going to take a look at the majority of circumstances. The problem that we have with suicide is that we don't know how to deal with the victims because we personally do not understand their logic. For example, if a person wants to commit suicide because of academic failure, a person who is doing well in his academics or probably failed in his academics don't understand the gravity or the logic behind wanting to kill yourself just because you failed an exam. The same exists with people who want to commit inseki jujutsu. In fact, the mere fact that in this debate, we don't really know the logic of why people do it, and we don't even want to make a value judgment as to whether or not it is correct, and we want to subject ourselves to the subjective morality of it, means that we don't fully understand the logic of people who want to commit inseki jujutsu. Why is that an important characterization? Number one, without these narratives, the tendency on government side is to isolate these individuals because you don't understand the logical process under which they operate. And what's worse is, on their side of the house, when you demonize that concept, when you demonize the possible honorability of that particular action, people who are starting to think about inseki jujutsu don't want to talk about their plight. They don't talk to their friends about it. They don't talk in the same way that pedophiles don't talk about their possible pedophilia to their friends. And that's where we are unable to really control the discourse, and we're unable to really help these individuals get over that particular logic. So conversely, on our side of the house, what we offer to you is the ability to engage with these people who have this form of ideation. Mind you, the only time that we were able to deal with people who wanted to commit suicide was when people who were almost on the verge of committing suicide came out with their stories instead of disgracing themselves or thinking that because they tried suicide before, they're automatically dishonorable. We think it's important to understand the logic of these individuals, and that can only be done in a world where you understand their story, and it can only happen when their narratives are out there. But second, and this is more important, right? We say that it's important for psychological communities to actually hear these narratives because majority of the problems that are dealt with from a psychological standpoint are largely Western, because majority of psychological studies are conducted in the West, probably because they have funding. But the problem with that, Madam Speaker, is that without these narratives, the only types of problems or the only types of logic for suicide that we understand are those that exist in a Western view. So these are largely individualistic concerns. How do we combat suicide? Because people fail their exams. How do we combat suicide? Because someone lost a job. In the West, they don't understand why people feel the need to commit suicide because their family member did something wrong. And we think that that important logic can only be derived from narratives, and that's why we don't think it's worth rejecting, but rather we have to seep it into social consciousness. Mind you, we are not saying, we are not promoting a particular value judgment as to whether or not the narrative is good, as to whether or not the narrative is true. But what we are saying is that the narrative must exist in order for us to further understand these people and to further understand how we can deal with them. Secondly, and quite briefly, how do we deal with the memory of these individuals? Because there's a bit of a deadlock coming from the government and opposition here, right? About whether or not these people are justified to do so because, you know, they're taking time away from the courts. The first liability of human beings, Madam Speaker, is to themselves. And that's why we allow euthanasia, even if it has adverse consequences for people in your families, or if it has adverse consequences for other people who might commit suicide. The reason is because we understand that there are different pains that people go through. They may probably want to commit suicide because they don't want to deal with the public. They don't want to deal with the torture of having to face their family every day with that guilt, right? And we say that while we don't fully understand that, we think it's equally valuable for people to make that momentous decision to end their life, regardless of the consequences. And with that, we're very proud to oppose.
Okay.
1 minute. Let's now like to invite the government to the podium here.
Yeah. Death is final. It silences your voice and strips you of the opportunity to connect with your loved ones. It takes away the ability of communities to heal and family and friends to be cognizant of your genuine mistakes. But most fundamentally, we think death is disproportionate, and that's why we stand for a side where capital punishment is no longer tolerated in today's society. 3 things in my speech today. First, on CO's stigmatization or destigmatization of suicide case, which by the way is basically a repetition of DLO's last 3 minutes. Secondly, on the idea of justice and why exactly our extension was never touched upon concerning proportionality of justice. And finally, in terms of why exactly OO's hashtag not all cases is not a legitimate counter-off to this debate today. But first, let's deal with CO, because the majority of the case, right, is a generic claim that you want a society where suicide is destigmatized. My first generic observation is this is never clearly linked back to motion. Why particularly this debate, right? Why particularly the destigmatization of honor killings in these particular instances as opposed to supporting a norm where people can choose and opt into suicide if they want? But we also posit that there's already other norms independent of this motion that allow people or say it is permissible for you to commit suicide. One, in Western societies dealing with their context, the idea of individual autonomy, that you can make choices about your own body, that your own body is political and therefore you can make the choices for when you end your life. 2, existentialism rising from Sartre in the 1950s, where increasingly life is seen as a fickle episode of capricious memories that may fade and pass as life wanes on, like the beats beating or the boats beating and the tides of the Great Gatsby. 3, the concept that individuals can do the right thing in their own opinions, but not necessarily suicide. The upshot here is that we can generally destigmatize suicide without having this particular process of destigmatizing honor killing in these instances. But secondly, I'm also not sure why, to the extent there's some paternalistic pressure for you not to kill yourself, why is that bad, right? We see some coercive norms in society nowadays to eat more green food, to do more exercise and all these things. We're okay with that form of coercion because it's in the end we think good for you as the end goal, right? Note here that this is often the case for those who commit suicide, especially those who disproportionately commit suicide as an unjust treatment to themselves, right? Why? Because life or the loss of life deprives you of opportunity to access friends, your loved ones, of goods, of career choices, of autonomy, of children you never have, of family and loved ones you never meet, and all of these are cases of deprived goods, so we think it is good. There's some stigma against suicide. Final response, they say, and this is the only attempt they link it back to motion, they say, well, you won't come out with stories if you feel like you're being shamed. Here's the thing, you're already being shamed in the status quo for being a perpetrator, and if anything, the obsession with death and suicide crowds out your realization that coming forth reality and truth is the better way to go. So if I want to turn this argument, I say psychological obsession with suicide fundamentally crowds out your desire to come out with testimony. That is why the entire CO case falls. Like, let's then deal with like our extension, right? Because who are the people that we're talking about in our extension never dealt with? 1, perpetrators who do not deserve death, but unfortunately amplify the sense of guilt to the extent they think suicide is the way out. Because for them, right, facing the court pressures, facing testimony, especially if you're an African American in a racist court structure, is disproportionately more costly than an easier way out. We think this is bad because the actual benefits for them are still there, right? African Americans still have families and friends and whatnot, but because of that short-term impulse, they kill themselves and lose out all their long-term gains. This also deals with their stuff from both options by choice, right? Because we limit people's autonomy of choice when we don't think they're making the actual interest that reflect the critical underlying interest. That is why we don't think the autonomy claim stands coming from them. The second group we're talking about here are families and friends. Note that comparison between imprisonment and suicide is that when you lose someone, you literally use that unique bundle of cells that you can interact with, the unique stories, the testimony, your love and relationship with them. You can still visit them in prison, you can still visit them when you do community service, but once they die, it's final. I know this because a friend of mine recently chose to end their lives, and now I cannot talk to them beyond the unanswered Facebook messages I stare at every night to remind myself of the stories untold and the events that never unfolded. Finally, you diminish the ability of communities to generate rallying cries. Note, political capital is scarce, right? So when suicide crowds out the attention and trends the narrative fundamentally of other stories, persecuting justice and whatnot, that's when it's far harder for communities of victims to galvanize and rally, especially when, as Junbyum pointed out, you're seen as the person who called the perpetrator to kill themselves. Now that ambiguity makes you seem like you're in the wrong. That's why you're less likely to want to come forth with testimony or to pursue justice, because you fear that others will say, this is the person that led to the suicide of this prominent figure, that's why it's bad. Why does this happen? And this is where Junbyum's stuff comes in. He gave say 4 reasons fundamentally why exactly punishment is likely to be disproportionate. 1, because blame is often subjective and arbitrary and assigned based on minority tropes and stereotypes. That's why women are told they ought to feel guilty and accompany as children. Or if you're a corporate underworker working in a hierarchy, you're told that you're responsible instead of the fuck-ups made by your bosses. That's why the targets of this guilt is often not the individuals that are genuinely at fault, and therefore there's a principle of lack of justice here. Secondly, because people often see death as an easier way out or a glorified way out on your side, right? That is why fundamentally a lot of people who don't deserve and shouldn't be dying then push themselves to a verdict and brink of suicide. That's a unique extension, no responses from them. Then they say, I like this, they say, okay, if you commit suicide, you're born this way, hashtag Lady Gaga, right? Problem with that argument is, no. They never dealt with all the margins where the most vulnerable groups are affected, i.e. if you committed a crime and you don't ever want to report to the police and what, you're in a psychological state where your biological ideations and fixations from suicide can be manipulated upon by that norm. That is why this is a subset of people that are most vulnerable, and this deals with their mitigation, which is, oh, the only cure is that you have the genes to do so. And that's a really lazy rebuttal, and I also don't think that dealt with the bulk of our cases of social coercion that pushes you to the brink of suicide. That's why CEO's argument falls. But let's deal with OO. They say, hashtag, why not all? Note, John Beam's material shows you why having some narrative, a narrative, can lead to the overarching outcome of excessive and coercive norms being the case, right? So you can't run away from the debate like that. You gave lots of reasons about media bandwagon, kangaroo courts and all that. All of these things mean you can't just be like, I like the good part of this norm, not the bad part, because the bad part spills over to the good part. It's like pouring toxins into the river, and you can't just be like, I like this part of the river but not the entire river, because that's the fucking point of debating. No, the second thing I want to note here is weighing up. Why exactly do we care more about people who die innocently versus the people who die justly on their side? 1, because we think that for the very same reason you wouldn't lock up an innocent person to save society or to instrumentalize them as a tool and battering ram, you wouldn't also tolerate killing people and forcing them to commit suicide or pressuring them to commit suicide in order to achieve some abstract societal goals. And that's also the very same reason why I think OG, by the way, is kind of outright. Not only did they never prove their claims, they also never taught us why exactly that's relevant to suicide, to life and death, to people's own autonomy and stories that remain untold and opportunities unlived and whatnot. The second weighing up here, though, is I think that the buy-in in the justice system decreases when it's seen as disproportionately penalizing those who are innocent. When your justice system is not punishing those who should be held accountable, that is when you have far more spillover harms in the long run, and if all of these harms are at least as important as the stuff in OG, if not more powerful than material from them. For all of these reasons, I'm so afraid to propose today.
Thank you, and I'd like to invite the opposition whip to conclude this whole debate.
Gentlemen, opposition came up here and told us all these harms about this specific type of suicide, right? But this debate is about comparatives and which side actually helps to prevent the most deaths. And on our side, we have told you many reasons why, which is about narratives and also how we allow people to understand more about suicides, then able to talk more openly about suicides, and also how when we respect the memory of the dead, in some cases we understand that these is the last people's choice and therefore they are forced to make this decision. But firstly, I'm going to go on to rebutting my opposition and then going on to my two clashes, which is who prevents the most deaths, and who prevents the most suicides in aging culture, and then also why is it important to respect the memory of the dead, right? Firstly, opposition came up and gave two fatal assumptions. Firstly, they said that people often will die because of the mistargeted blame. They assume that when people commit suicide, it is because of what other people think of them. But in many cases, this is a personal decision. And when they decide to commit suicide, it's not only about other factors, but more the fact about how they feel, and therefore this is how this point does not even matter. But then the second assumption that they made is that they paint a world in which people are just willing to jump out the window every time they feel shame, right? If I jumped out the window and committed suicide every single time that the tiny bit that I felt shame, then I would have died many times. But the thing is that as my
the speaker has said already, no thank you. Humans biologically, we treasure our lives and we want to save our lives. We don't just randomly throw our lives away just because we feel shame for one reason, right? And in our world, we show you that people, when they have nowhere else to turn to, when they are in pain, when they cannot face this, and opposition gave us all these benefits of living, which we also agree with. For example, being able to talk to friends, being able to go to work, being able to contribute to society, right? But when we see that in the worst cases, when you are so shamed, when you make mistakes so bad, that you have hurt so many people, that you don't want to talk to your friends, that you have no chance of ever getting another job, when you have all these other detriments, no thank you. When you cannot have the benefits of what opposition have told us, when you are being pushed to live in this world where you can just not take it anymore, we believe it is justified to commit this kind of suicide. We're not encouraging people to commit suicide, but we understand that in some cases, when people just cannot take it anymore, it is justified to do so. Okay, so this goes on to my point about respecting the memory of the dead, right? We do not want to encourage suicide, but principally in some cases, we understand that people will do it in the worst case. And as my partner has said, for example, in euthanasia, we understand that this is bad, but in some cases, when these patients are in pain, when these patients cannot take it anymore, there is no hope. We respect their choice to take their lives into our own hand and be like, okay, there's no point of me living anymore, and therefore I want to take this into my own hands, and I am willing to die. Okay, and the next thing I want to talk about is that people have the right to life just as they have the right to end their lives, right? We believe that it is completely unjustified to shame these people, shame the dead, and say, okay, for example, if someone killed themselves because they were unable to manage these finances. But for example, they were unable to manage these finances, but the fact that they needed to do these finances was because maybe they wanted to start a business to help millions of people to sell these drugs that will cure some kind of disease, right? We will completely forget all of that if this person commits suicide. We forget everything that he's done, all the good things that he's done, the person that he was. For example, maybe he was a father, he was a loving father, he was a loving husband. We forget all the good things that he's done, all the things that he's brought into society, and instead we say, okay, this person killed himself. We think that this is wrong, and especially in Asian societies where we see suicide as taboo, we will be shaming this person forever. And we believe that this is not right, and as opening proposition said, that it is unjust for us to say bad things about people. We totally agree with that. And we believe that people have no right to judge someone who has killed themselves when they have no understanding of what this person has gone through. And this also goes back to my first point, which is that we will help to prevent death for the living when we are able to understand people's narrative, right? In the current society, especially in Asian culture, right? Opposition came up and told us about all these things in Western culture where we understand more about depression. Okay, great. We understand that in Western culture we know more about depression, but currently this is a specific suicide that is in Asian culture. This is specific to Asian culture, okay? It's specifically in Japanese culture. No, thank you. So we understand that in Western cultures we are opening up through TV shows, movies, and advertisements, and talking to students about how to deal with mental health issues and all that such, right? But we see in Asian cultures, having depression is taboo. It is not talked about, and people are shamed for committing suicide. When they commit suicide, as I said earlier, people say, okay, this person killed themselves. We're not going to talk about him because committing suicide is something that's bad, and we should not do that, right? But we believe that people have no right to judge a person when they don't understand what their story was or what drove them to commit suicide. And therefore, when we understand the importance of the narrative, when we understand why people are committing suicide and what is driving people to commit suicide, not only do we gain the respect of these people committing suicide, but then we're also able to properly prevent other people from committing suicide. In many cases, no thank you, in many cases, when people commit suicide, we are unable to know what they're thinking because this is an internal decision. It comes from within. We are unable to understand the many reasons why people commit suicide. But when we make this honorable, we are able to more understand why people might want to be able to commit suicide, and therefore be able to try and prevent these suicides from happening in the future. Okay, when this type of suicide is not shamed, therefore people can come out and talk more openly about this type of suicide. When you're saying, okay, I feel like I want to commit suicide, right? And I feel very shamed, and I feel like I want to commit this type of suicide. I can't say because I can't say words properly. But anyways, instead of being shamed, right? In the status quo, when people want to commit suicide in Asian countries, they don't say anything. They don't go and try to get help because if they tell someone that are thinking of committing suicide, they will just be saying, oh, you're just trying to commit suicide just to, get out of being shamed, as the opposition has said. But instead, we make this kind of community and this world where people are going to be able to talk openly about committing suicide and be able to go and find help and not being scared of saying, okay, I'm depressed, I have nowhere else to go, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Instead of feeling shamed, they're going to be able to go and find help and be able to share their story, share their narrative, to not only help themselves, but to help others. And today, because we are the side that showed how we are the side that cares about the people's narratives, we are the side that prevents most suicides, and we are the side that respects the memory of the dead, this is why this motion is our fault. Thank you very much.
Players cross forward, shake hands, and they are divided. I think I might need some amount